Chapter 20, Part 2 of An Antarctic Mystery, or the Sphinx of the Ice Fields. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. An Antarctic Mystery by Jules Verne. Chapter 20, Part 2. Unmerciful Disaster. One day, as we were seated on the summit of the iceberg, gazing fixedly on the deceptive horizon, he exclaimed: "Who could ever have imagined, Mr. Jeorling, when the Halbrane left Kerguelen, that 6½ months afterwards she would be stuck on the side of an ice mountain?" "A fact much more to be regretted," I replied, "because only for that accident we should have attained our object, and we should have begun our return journey." "I didn't mean to contradict," replied the boatswain, "but you say we should have attained our object. Do you mean by that that we should have found our countrymen?" "Perhaps." "I can scarcely believe such would have been the case, Mr. Jeorling, although this was the principal and perhaps even the only object of our navigation in the polar seas." "The only one, yes, at the start," I insinuated, "but since the half-breed's revelations about Arthur Pym—" "Ah, you are always harking back on that subject, like brave Dirk Peters." "Always, Hurliguerly, and only that a deplorable and unforeseen accident made us run aground." "I leave you to your delusions, Mr. Jeorling, since you believe you have run aground. Why, is not this the case?" "In any case, it is a wonderful running aground," replied the boatswain. "Instead of a good solid bottom, we have run aground in the air." "Then I am right, Hurliguerly, in saying that it is an unfortunate adventure." "Unfortunate, truly, but in my opinion we should take warning by it." "What warning?" "That it is not permitted for us to venture so far in these latitudes, and I believe that the Creator forbids his creatures to climb to the summit of the poles." "Notwithstanding that, the summit of one pole is only 60 miles away from us now." "Granted, Mr. Jeorling, but these 60 miles are equal to thousands when we have no means of making them. And if the launch of the schooner is not successful, here we are, condemned to winter quarters which the polar bears themselves would hardly relish." I replied only by a shake of my head, which Hurliguerly could not fail to understand. "Do you know, Mr. Jeorling, of what I think oftenest?" "What do you think of, boatswain?" "Of the Kerguelens, whither we are certainly not travelling. Truly, in a bad season it was cold enough there. There is not much difference between this archipelago and the islands situated on the edge of the Antarctic Sea. But there one is not far from the Cape, and if we want to warm our shins, no iceberg bars the way. Whereas here it is the devil to weigh anchor, and one never knows if one shall find a clear course." "I repeat it, boatswain, if this last accident had not occurred, everything would have been over by this time, one way or another. We should still have had more than 6 weeks to get out of these southern seas. It is seldom that a ship is so roughly treated as ours has been, and I consider it real bad luck after our having profited by such fortunate circumstances." "These circumstances are all over, Mr. Jeorling," exclaimed Hurliguerly, "and I fear indeed—" "What, you also, boatswain? You, whom I believed to be so confident?" "Confidence, Mr. Jeorling, wears out like the ends of one's trousers. What would you have me do? When I compare my lot to old Atkins, installed in his cosy inn, when I think of the Green Cormorant, of the big parlours downstairs, with the little tables round which friends sip whisky and gin, discussing the news of the day, while the stove makes more noise than the weathercock on the roof, oh, then the comparison is not in our favour, and in my opinion Mr. Atkins enjoys life better than I do." "You shall see them all again, boatswain. Atkins, the Green Cormorant, and the Kerguelen. For God's sake, do not let yourself grow downhearted, and if you, a sensible and courageous man, despair already—" "Oh, if I were the only one it would not be half so bad as it is." "The whole crew does not despair, surely?" "Yes and no," replied Hurliguerly, "for I know some who are not at all satisfied." "Has Hearne begun his mischief again? Is he exciting his companion?" "Not openly, at least, Mr. Jeorling, and since I have kept him under my eye, I have neither seen nor heard anything. Besides, he knows what awaits him if he budges. I believe I am not mistaken, The sly dog has changed his tactics. But what does not astonish me in him, astonishes me in Martin Holt." "What do you mean, boatswain?" "That they seem to be on good terms with each other. See how Hearne seeks out Martin Holt, talks to him frequently, and Holt does not treat his overtures unfavourably. Martin Holt is not one of those who would listen to Hearne's advice, or follow it if he tried to provoke rebellion amongst the crew." "No doubt, Mr. Jeorling. However, I don't fancy seeing them so much together. Hearne is a dangerous and unscrupulous individual, and most likely Martin Holt does not distrust him sufficiently." "He is wrong, boatswain." "And wait a moment. Do you know what they were talking about the other day when I overheard a few scraps of their conversation?" "I could not possibly guess until you tell me, Hurliguerly." "Well, while they were conversing on the bridge of the Halbrane, I heard them talking about Dirk Peters, and Hearne was saying, 'You must not owe a grudge to the half-breed, Master Holt, because he refused to respond to your advances and accept your thanks. If he be only a sort of brute, he possesses plenty of courage, and has shown it in getting you out of a bad corner at the risk of his life. And besides, do not forget that he formed part of the crew of the Grampus, and your brother Ned, if I don't mistake." "He said that, boatswain? He spoke of the Grampus?" I exclaimed. "Yes, of the Grampus." "And of Ned Holt?" "Precisely, Mr. Jeorling." "And what answer did Martin Holt make?" "He replied, 'I don't even know under what circumstances my unfortunate brother perished. Was it during a revolt on board? Brave man that he was, he would not betray his captain, and perhaps he was massacred.'" "Did Hearne dwell on this, boatswain?" "Yes, but he added, 'It is very sad for you, Master Holt. The captain of the Grampus, according to what I have been told, was abandoned, being placed in a small boat with one or two of his men, and who knows if your brother was not along with them?'" "And what next?" "Then, Mr. Jeorling," he added, "did it never occur to you to ask Dirk Peters to enlighten you on the subject?" "Yes, once," replied Martin Holt. "I questioned the half-breed about it, and never did I see a man so overcome. He replied in so low a voice that I could scarcely understand him. 'I know not, I know not.' And he ran away with his face buried in his hands." "Was that all you heard of the conversation, boatswain?" "That was all, Mr. Jeorling, and I thought it so strange that I wished to inform you of it." "And what conclusion did you draw from it?" "Nothing, except that I look upon the sealing master as a scoundrel of deepest dye, perfectly capable of working in secret for some evil purpose with which he would like to associate Martin Holt." What did Hearne's new attitude mean? Why did he strive to gain Martin Holt, one of the best of the crew, as an ally? Why did he recall the scenes of the Grampus? Did Hearne know more of this matter of Dirk Peters and Ned Holt than the others, this secret which the half-breed and I believed ourselves to be the sole possessors? The doubt caused me serious uneasiness. However, I took care not to say anything of it to Dirk Peters. If he had for a moment suspected that Hearne spoke of what happened on board the Grampus, if he had heard that the rascal, as Hurliguerly called him, and not without reason, constantly talked to Martin Holt about his brother, I really do not know what would have happened. In short, whatever the intentions of Hearne might be, it was dreadful to think that our sailing master, on whose fidelity Captain Len Guy ought to be able to count, was in conspiracy with him. The sealing master must have a strong motive for acting in this way. What it was I could not imagine. Although the crew seemed to have abandoned every thought of mutiny, a strict watch was kept, especially on Hearne. Besides, the situation must soon change, at least so far as the schooner was concerned. 2 days afterwards the work was finished. The caulking operations were completed, and also the slide for lowering the vessel to the base of our floating mountain. Just now the upper portion of the ice had been slightly softened, so that this last work did not entail much labour for pickaxe or spade. The course ran obliquely round the west side of the berg, so that the incline should not be too great at any point. With cables properly fixed, the launch, it seemed, might be effected without any mishap. I rather feared lest the melting of the ice should make the gliding less smooth at the lower part of the berg. Needless to say, the cargo, masting, anchors, chains, etc., had not been put on board. The hull was quite heavy enough, and not easily moved, so it was necessary to lighten it as much as possible. When the schooner was again in its element, the loading could be effected in a few days. On the afternoon of the 28th, the finishing touches were given. It was necessary to put supports for the sides of the slide in some places where the ice had melted quickly. Then every one was allowed to rest from 4 p.m. The captain had double rations served out to all hands, and well they merited this extra supply of spirits. They had indeed worked hard during the week. I repeated that every sign of mutiny had disappeared. The crew thought of nothing except this great operation of the launching. The Halbrane in the sea would mean departure. It would also mean return. For Dirk Peters and me it would be the definite abandonment of Arthur Pym. That night the temperature was at the highest we had so far experienced. The thermometer registered 53 degrees, 11.67 degrees Celsius above zero. So, although the sun was nearing the horizon, the ice was melting, and thousands of small streams flowed in every direction. The early birds woke at 4 o'clock, and I was one of their number. I had scarcely slept, and I fancy that Dirk Peters did not sleep much, haunted as he was by the sad thought of having to turn back. The launch was to take place at 10 o'clock. Taking every possible difficulty into account, and allowing for the minutest precautions, the captain hoped that it would be completed before the close of the day. Every one believed that by evening the schooner would be at the foot of the berg. Of course we all had to lend a hand to this difficult task. To each man a special duty was assigned. Some were employed to facilitate the sliding with wooden rollers if necessary, others to moderate the speed of the hull in case it became too great, by means of hawsers and cables. We breakfasted at 9 o'clock in the tents. Our sailors were perfectly confident, and could not refrain from drinking success to the event. And although this was a little premature, we added our hurrahs to theirs. Success seemed very nearly assured, as the captain and the mate had worked out the matter so carefully and skilfully. At last we were about to leave our encampment and take up our stations. Some of the sailors were there already, when cries of amazement and fear were raised. What a frightful scene, and short as it may have been, what an impression of terror it left on our minds! One of the enormous blocks which formed the bank of the mud bed where the Halbrane lay, having become loose owing to the melting of its base, had slipped and was bounding over the others down the incline. In another moment the schooner, being no longer retained in position, was swinging on this declivity. On board, on deck, in front, there were two sailors, Rogers and Gratian. In vain did the unfortunate men try to jump over the bulwarks. They had not time, and they were dragged away in this dreadful fall. Yes, I saw it. I saw the schooner topple over, slide down first on its right side, crush one of the men who delayed too long about jumping to one side, then bound from block to block, and finally fling itself into space. In another moment the Halbrane staved in, broken up, with gaping planks and shattered ribs, had sunk, causing a tremendous jet of water to spout up at the foot of the iceberg. Horrified, yes, indeed we were horrified when the schooner, carried off as though by an avalanche, had disappeared in the abyss. Not a particle of our Halbrane remained, not even a wreck. A minute ago she was 100 feet in the air. Now she was 500 in the depths of the sea. Yes, we were so stupefied that we were unable to think of the dangers to come. Our amazement was that of people who cannot believe their eyes. Prostration succeeded as a natural consequence. There was not a word spoken. We stood motionless, with our feet rooted to the icy soil. No words could express the horror of our situation. As for West, when the schooner had disappeared in the abyss, I saw big tears fall from his eyes. The Halbrane that he loved so much was now an unknown quantity. Yes, our stout-hearted mate wept. 3 of our men had perished, and in what frightful fashion! I had seen Rogers and Gratian, 2 of our most faithful sailors, stretch out their hands in despair as they were knocked about by the rebounding of the schooner, and finally sink with her. The other man from the Falklands, an American, was crushed in its rush. His shapeless form lay in a pool of blood. 3 new victims within the last 10 days had to be inscribed on the register of those who died during this fatal voyage. Ah, fortune had favoured us up to the hour when the Halbrane was snatched from her own element, but her hand was now against us, and was not this last the worst blow? Must it not prove the stroke of death? The silence was broken by a tumult of despairing voices, whose despair was justified, indeed, by this irreparable misfortune. And I am sure that more than one thought it would have been better to have been on the Halbrane as she rebounded off the side of the iceberg. Everything would have been over then, as it was all over with Rogers and Gratian. This foolish expedition would thus have come to a conclusion worthy of such rashness and imprudence. At last the instinct of self-preservation triumphed, and, except Hearne, who stood some distance off, and affected silence, all the men shouted, "To the boat! To the boat!" These unfortunate fellows were out of their mind. Terror led them astray. They rushed towards the crag where our one boat, which could not hold them all, had been sheltered during the unloading of the schooner. Captain Len Guy and Jem West rushed after them. I joined them immediately, followed by the boatswain. We were armed, and resolved to make use of our arms. We had to prevent these furious men from seizing the boat, which did not belong to a few, but to all. "Hallo, sailors!" cried the captain. "Hallo!" repeated West. "Stop there, or we fire on the first who goes a step farther." Both threatened the men with their pistols. The boatswain pointed his gun at them. I held my rifle, ready to fire. It was in vain. The frenzied men heard nothing, would not hear anything, and one of them fell, struck by the mate's bullet, just as he was crossing the last block. He was unable to catch on to the bank with his hands, and slipping on the frozen slope, he disappeared in the abyss. Was this the beginning of a massacre? Would others let themselves be killed at this place? Would the old hands side with the newcomers? At that moment I remarked that Hardy, Martin Holt, Francis Bury, and Stern hesitated about coming over to our side, while Hearne, still standing motionless at some distance, gave no encouragement to the rebels. However, we could not allow them to become masters of the boat, to bring it down, to embark 10 or 12 men, and to abandon us to our certain fate on this iceberg. They had almost reached the boat, heedless of danger and deaf to threats, when a second report was heard, and one of the sailors fell by a bullet from the boatswain's gun. One American and one Fuegian, less to be numbered amongst the sealing master's partisans. Then, in front of the boat, a man appeared. It was Dirk Peters, who had climbed the opposite slope. The half-breed put one of his enormous hands on the stern, and with the other made a sign to the furious men to clear off. Dirk Peters being there, we no longer needed our arms, as he alone would suffice to protect the boat. And indeed, as 5 or 6 of the sailors were advancing, he went up to them, caught hold of the nearest by the belt, lifted him up, and sent him flying 10 paces off. The wretched man, not being able to catch hold of anything, would have rebounded into the sea had not Hearne seized him. Owing to the half-breed's intervention, the revolt was instantly quelled. Besides, we were coming up to the boat, and with us those of our men whose hesitation had not lasted long. No matter, the others were still 13 to our 10. Captain Len Guy made his appearance. Anger shone in his eyes, and with him was West, quite unmoved. Words failed the captain for some moments, but his look said what his tongue could not utter. At length, in a terrible voice, he said: "I ought to treat you as evil doers. However, I will only consider you as madmen. The boat belongs to everybody. It is now our only means of salvation, and you wanted to steal it like cowards. Listen attentively to what I say for the last time. This boat, belonging to the Halbrane, is now the Halbrane herself. I am captain of it, and let him who disobey me beware." With these last words Captain Len Guy looked at Hearne, for whom this warning was expressly meant. The sealing master had not appeared in the last scene, not openly at least, but nobody doubted that he had urged his comrades to make off with the boat, and that he had every intention of doing the same again. "Now to the camp," said the captain, "and you, Dirk Peters, remain here." The half breed's only reply was to nod his big head and betake himself to his post. The crew returned to the camp without the least hesitation. Some lay down in their sleeping places, others wandered about. Hearne neither tried to join them nor go near Martin Holt. Now that the sailors were reduced to idleness, there was nothing to do except to ponder on our critical situation, and invent some means of getting out of it. The captain, the mate, and the boatswain formed a council, and I took part in their deliberations. Captain Len began by saying: "We have protected our boat, and we shall continue to protect it." "Until death," declared West. "Who knows," said I, "whether we shall not soon be forced to embark?" "In that case," replied the captain, "as all cannot fit into it, it will be necessary to make a selection. Lots shall determine which of us are to go, and I shall not ask to be treated differently from the others." "We have not come to that, luckily," replied the boatswain. "The iceberg is solid, and there is no fear of its melting before winter." "No," assented West, "that is not to be feared. What it behoves us to do is, while watching the boat, to keep an eye on the provisions." "We are lucky," added Hurliguerly, "to have put our cargo in safety. Poor dear Halbrane! She will remain in these seas like the Jane, her elder sister." Yes, without doubt, and I thought so for many reasons, the one destroyed by the savages of Tsalal, the other by one of these catastrophes that no human power can prevent. "You are right," replied the captain, "and we must prevent our men from plundering. We are sure of enough provisions for 1 year, without counting what we may get by fishing." "And it is so much more the necessary, captain, to keep a close watch, because I have seen some hovering about the spirit casks." "I will see to that," replied West. "But," I then asked, "had we not better prepare ourselves for the fact that we may be compelled to winter on this iceberg?" "May Heaven avert such a terrible probability," replied the captain. "After all, if it were necessary, we could get through it, Mr. Jeorling," said the boatswain. "We could hollow out sheltering places in the ice, so as to be able to bear the extreme cold of the Pole, and so long as we had sufficient to appease our hunger." At this moment the horrid recollection of the Grampus came to my mind, the scenes in which Dirk Peters had killed Ned Holt, the brother of our sailing master. Should we ever be in such extremity? Would it not, before we proceed to set up winter quarters for 7 or 8 months, be better to leave the iceberg altogether, if such a thing were possible? I called the attention of Captain Len Guy and West to this point. This was a difficult question to answer, and a long silence preceded the reply. At last the captain said: "Yes, that would be the best resolution to come to, and if our boat could hold us all, with the provisions necessary for a voyage that might last 3 or 4 weeks, I would not hesitate to put to sea now and return towards the north." But I made them observe that we should be obliged to direct our course contrary to wind and current. Our schooner herself could hardly have succeeded in doing this, whilst it continued towards the south. "Towards the south?" repeated the captain, who looked at me as though he sought to read my thoughts. "Why not?" I answered. "If the iceberg had not been stopped in its passage, perhaps it would have drifted to some land in that direction, and might not our boat accomplish what it would have done?" The captain, shaking his head, answered nothing. West was also silent. "Eh, our iceberg will end by raising its anchor," replied Hurliguerly. "It does not hold to the bottom, like the Falklands or the Kerguelens, so the safest course is to wait, as the boat cannot carry 23, the number of our party." I dwelt upon the fact that it was not necessary for all 23 to embark. It would be sufficient, I said, for 5 or 6 of us to reconnoitre further south for 12 or 15 miles. "South?" repeated Captain Len Guy. "Undoubtedly, captain," I added. You probably know what the geographers frankly admit, that the Antarctic regions are formed by a capped continent." "Geographers know nothing and can know nothing about it," replied West, coldly. "It is a pity," said I, "that as we are so near we should not attempt to solve this question of a polar continent." I thought it was better not to insist just at present. CHAPTER 21.